Yes, yes. I got a lesson for you. You didn't learn in school. Too much lip doesn't make you hip. And being quiet don't mean you's a fool. Just cause I'm out of your mind. I ain't crazy, baby, you know, yeah. I'll admit I had better sense before you treated me so unkind. Look, I'm from Washington, D.C., so don't you mess with me. Cause I'll take out my razor and cut you and go hee 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 hee. I don't have to be crazy, baby, just cause I'm out of your mind. But I'll admit, baby, I had better sense before you treated me so unkind. Oh, yeah. Lawrence Wheatley. Lawrence Wheatley. Lawrence Wheatley. Lawrence Wheatley and Homemade Jam.
And, of course, that is Napoleon Turner. Longtime listeners of this station remember Nap Turner, who was the vocalist on this Homemade Jam concert. We also heard a fine baritone saxophone solo from Charlie Young. And that was not Chutzpah, that was actually the Out of Your Mind Blues by Lawrence Wheatley and his octet called Homemade Jam. We are celebrating the musical legacy of Lawrence Wheatley, the late Lawrence Wheatley, who passed last week. I think it was last Sunday at the age of 73. And I am joined here in the studio by Lawrence's son, Lorenz, also Andrew White, Abu Richard Spencer, Peter Muldoon, and just joining us now is trombonist Lincoln Ross. Lincoln, you were on that concert, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so what do you remember of that night, and Lawrence, and the music, and just the whole event?
Well, I heard you talk about it earlier, and I wish I could remember exactly when it was, but it was a groove, man. It was a good crowd. You know, we didn't get as much chance to rehearse as Lawrence would have liked, but he called up all the guys in town, you know, that were doing it, and I was just looking a little old lucky me. I was in the right company that day with Buck Hill and all those guys, man. So it was a lot of fun. And that tune right there, I don't have to be crazy, baby, just because you're out of my mind, brings to mind something I wanted to mention about Lawrence. He had a good sense of humor, and he would tell me all the time. He said, a sense of humor will get you through when nothing else in the world will work. and Lord, that's the truth, especially now. I'm trying to laugh. That's Lawrence, isn't it?
There were a lot of things about Lawrence that were, I mean, he didn't imitate people. He was his own person, right? And there were certain things, his use of language, for example, was fascinating. And I'd like you to think of some examples. For instance, if you were to ask Lawrence, how you doing? What would he say?
Hoping and coping.
Yeah. Hoping and coping, right?
And then more recently, striving and thriving.
That's right.
And then he would say,
driving and thriving is better than jiving and conniving.
There you go.
That's right. Thank you, Peter. That was cool. I also like a lot of his song titles. They're almost like poems if you think of them collectively.
Well, you know, he was a wordsmith for sure, and he's been working on he was working on a collection of his musings called "A Mammal in Musings of a Mammal in the Milky Way." So, you know, he had a lot of alliterations, among others. I mean, obviously that was a thing in rhymes. But, you know, he was very contemplative, you know, and most recently he was almost in a monastic situation, not necessarily by choice, but circumstance. And
what does that mean exactly?
Well, I mean, he I guess, in the true sense of the word, was a maverick, more so than some of these politicians out here, because he was below everybody's radar, man. I mean, you know, and he came out of the beat generation, and so, you know, he's part of the counter or subcultures that way.
So he was a bohemian.
Exactly.
Okay.
And but, you know, he had a chance to observe the world in a unique way, and because he had this perspective that most of us don't have, because you know, he chose to deal with the world mainly on his own terms, and he was very successful at that. It kind of stressed some of the rest of us out, but that's another story. But you know, I'll give him his props that way, and but you know, and he would take the time to think things through, because you know, most of us are reacting, and he's studied the situation maybe more than the average person has, and that's almost any given situation, and was able to, you know, reflect on it and then say, well, you know, maybe you should consider this, or at least I have, and I choose to deal with it this way. So he basically chose to deal with the world on his own terms. Matter of fact, most recently he shared with me and Lincoln another version or another song called My Way, and I got to find that, because of course we're going to play that at his memorial service.
It's not Paul Anka's song.
It's not Paul Anka's song.
Yeah.
It's something obscure to me, at least, and it nails him right. You know, he nails it right there with the lyrics that particular song has. So
Well, I have to ask, actually. Many people who sort of came into his orbit and started to realize how heavy he was as a musician and as a thinker and as a poet and as an artist, we all began to wonder, why aren't there more recordings? I mean, there are a couple of commercial things, one with Gene Ammons, one with Earl Coleman, and we have some sort of homemade things. Peter, why don't you share Lincoln's microphone? That microphone doesn't work. Why don't we, this is Peter Muldoon, guitarist who had been working with Lawrence over at Columbia Station.
I'd been sitting in with Lawrence. I did play on a gig with him once on one of my gigs, and I think that was the last gig he played, actually, up at what was Duke City. It's now Indulge, but that was, but I was, you know, sitting in with him. But I was just going to refer to what you were saying about recordings, because I'd asked Lawrence, I said, Lawrence, you've got to record this stuff. You know, he'd look at me and he'd pull out his handwritten manuscript, which, you know, some of it was older than me, actually, probably most of it, the original paper. And then he would, and he'd say, it's already recorded. You know, and so you know.
But this goes back to Andrew's point. Andrew's point earlier, that so much of the opportunities for musicians are created in the marketplace by recordings.
But his son, he wasn't interested in a basic commercial success, and I don't, I'm still trying to figure out what the deal is there. He was very content to, garner, be satisfied on his own terms, and then, the appreciation of his fellow musicians and artists. And I think part of that, though, speaks to what I think he believes, that in some ways that recordings were almost antithetical to, live music, because, people could buy the record and it could maybe diminish the opportunities for live music. Now, I don't believe in that, but, I think that was part of what was going on with him. He figures, he would rather enjoy the energy of a live audience.
Mm-hmm. And plus, he would say stuff like, if you're going to hear this, this is the only place you're gonna hear this.
Right.
And you just stop in your tracks and try to contemplate what he just said. But he was being pretty clear.
What was that he said? What was that? And I'm trying to remember what he said. If you are always chasing in your music, if you're always chasing after popular taste. You know this one?
I'm gonna have to think that one.
I never heard him say it before. Maybe it was I should have written it down. I wish I had a pen. I wish I had a tape recorder every time I was hanging out with Lawrence. You really needed a dictionary to hang out with Lawrence. Really, he actually made me get a dictionary.
It's just when you asked his son a question just now, and he gave you a word, you said, "What does that mean?" Now his dad wouldn't have explained it. He would have handed you the dictionary.
Yeah, you know.
He used to piss me off. I mean, I said, "Go ahead. I'm sorry."
Let me put this in here. This has been on my mind for about the last 5 minutes, but there was something mystical about Lawrence in the sense that I experienced the whole time I knew him. But this, many years ago, I can't remember when now, but Downbeat magazine published one of my transcriptions of a Coltrane solo, and I think it was a Countdown from the Giant Steps record. And I remember when we were setting up the deal and all, I said, well, let me think about it a minute. So I got the transcription out and I looked at it and everything, and I said, wow, this looks heavy, to show up in the magazine. But let me see. I said, look at all of these precautionary accidentals I have in here. But they weren't precautionaries from my perspective as an editor. I had to have them because there was so much going on harmonically, and you had to make sure that each note was clear to the utmost. Each note had to be symbolized with a symbol in front of it. And I said, wow, that sounds heavy, precautionary accidental. So I wrote it down on a piece of paper, and I said, I'm going to use this somewhere because that sounds heavy, So like about 4 months later, the magazine article came out, I looked at it, and I'd written a text to go with the transcription and everything. I said, man, this is heavy. I'm heavy. And 3 days after I read the article, I went down to the One Step Down to see one of the jam sessions, and I was standing out there on a break, and Lawrence came out. He said, yeah, Andrew, I saw your transcription in the Downbeat. It's very, very perceptive of you to use so many precautionary accidentals. And I said, yeah, it was eerie. I looked at him, I just looked at him, my eyes got big. I said, well, thank you very much. But I thought that was eerie. And it was something happened around town here that involved neglecting so many of the musicians who live here, And I remember thinking one time, I said, well, this is an international mecca. And so a lot of things don't happen for people on a local level when the international thing comes in and blah, blah. I said, international mecca, that sounds heavy. It really sounds, I wrote it down, I said, I'm going to have to use this somewhere, About 4 days after I did that, I was out with Lawrence somewhere, and we got to talking about whatever the scene was, and he said, yeah, you have to realize this is an international mecca. And I looked at him, I said, yeah, it's very perceptive. So I always keyed off of things like that. Those are the main two things I can recall where he just went in 2 or 3 days after I thought something up. He would say it right back at me. And I hadn't seen him. I wouldn't have seen him for some time. And then they would come up in conversation like that, and I just said, yeah, it was very perceptive of you.
Well, that's part of what's so interesting about him when we're thinking of Lawrence Wheatley is that so many of the things that he would say, or more importantly, the things he would do, are not just in the moment, but they're things that you can think about and reflect on. And as you say, they're deep.
Yeah.
So he had a highly evolved intelligence. Would you say he was intellectual?
I would say he's a genius. I mean, I don't know if that's... And just speaking on what you just said, Lawrence, he would say that knowledge is spherical, and where written words are more linear. But if you have enough of a repertoire with someone, your conversation could be spherical as well. But he had this. What makes me think that he was just beyond normal intelligence is also the way it seems that he could instantaneously create anagrams. He would take the words in a sentence, mix them up, and say something else. And he'd have these sort of jokes or sayings using them. And he'd have a way of saying something that 99% of the people in the room would just go straight over our heads. And then, like, you know, the next day you're like, whoa, you know, he would, you know, he'd have a lot of things like that. And
He also, did any of you ever play chess with him?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Lawrence.
Yeah, I mean, I you know, of course, he crushed my behind many times, and then we used to hang out down at DuPont Circle, because I mean that's where you have your chess jam sessions. But,
That's right.
but yeah, it got to a point though that I think I won a few games, you know, without thinking that he gave them to me. You know, he wasn't going to concede much to me, at least, you know.
You said that he gave you your first saxophone.
Yes, he did.
Did he give you lessons, or did he send you to someone else for instruction?
Well, he sent me to somebody else, Sonny Ra. And actually, you know, it's interesting because I first met Sonny Ra. Donald Byrd used to have the Howard Stage Band at this place called the Rojo up on New Hampshire off of Georgia. And that's where I saw him, and that's where I actually first saw Lincoln.
Really?
Yeah, because he was part of the Howard, Donald Byrd's. I mean, you were in school then. But the thing that, you know, I don't like to speak too much, the horn that he gave me leaked. I didn't know it at the time, and he was very critical of me, and I was trying to, you know, he was my musical inspiration, at least initially. So I was trying to please him, and he said, man, you know, I hear you playing, but it's just the tone's not round, and you could be projecting more. And so I developed somewhat of a complex, because after I got a better horn, it made all the difference in the world. The funny thing is, I was in junior high school at the time, and I thought I was something, because most folks were renting their horns, but they were going through Bellwin Band Builder 1 and 2, and I was still stuck in 1, you know, with this horn that leaked. Had brand new pads, but the pads weren't set, so, you know, so, you know, it leaked. I also, and he also told me to go check out Andrew White, and Andrew White said it's all about scales and arpeggios, and Andrew White, that was a quick lesson, but it was a concise and to the point, you know, it gave me some idea what I had to do. But what Peter was talking about, you know, the anagrams, and one of the last ones that Lawrence laid on me, and I'm sure others, was when you take the word listen, it also can spell silent. And, you know, Lawrence would do most of the talking, so he didn't want you to listen and be silent.
Was he self-taught as a pianist, as a composer?
He would say autodidactic. Yes, that's what the term is, self-taught, and that's a word that I've flaunted since I haven't finished school myself.
Did he have any kind of theories that you heard him talk about?
No, I think he may. I'm not sure. I don't know what kind of pedagogy he's had, but he was always talking about how important it is to be a good student, no matter what institution or under whose tutelage. He was more about the type of student you were. So the discipline there, you know, he exhibited pretty much, and he expected, for you to be serious about what it is you want to learn and apply yourself. And, you know, and he said, I could complain, but, you know, I just would rather, you know, stay at the task at hand and do what has to be done, you know, and keep moving. So,
Andrew?
Yeah, I want to say this, might be a little bit off the subject, but Peter, yes. Yeah, he mentioned Lawrence being a genius, and I recall I was talking to Lincoln Ross about this not too long ago, and Lorenz made a reference to recording earlier. You did as well, and I think I should say, maybe I might be the only one to say it today, but to record and do anything in the business context is totally separate from what many of us are interested in doing. Somebody mentioned that he wasn't interested in doing things on certain levels. And I was telling Lincoln, you know, many people who you think should have more notoriety and whatever and exposure, etc., don't have the acumen to do that. and therefore they have to have counterparts and people around them to carry on those extra steps and to do. Lawrence might have been he might be a person, might have been a person like that. I recall several conversations with him over the years where he expressed great interest in what I was doing in terms of business, but he never pursued that with me. He just expressed interest and he would make a comment as that's nice and so on and so forth, but he would never go off in that direction. Now, I was telling Lincoln earlier, I said, that's not unique. Many artists are like that.
So you think it was a conscious choice that he made to not document his work in recordings, or was it a matter of not being willing to compromise?
Both. It's with many of us, and then that extra dimension of not having it in your periphery to do that kind of thing at all. So you need to have somebody around you who'll pick up the ball and roll with it. That's not to say that there's any deficiency in anybody who doesn't do the whole 9 yards. But in most cases of artists who you see who are successful because of a display of a lot of their wares, is usually somebody else who comes in and picks up the ball and carries it to those extra dimensions. It's not the artist himself. So,
And if
Lawrence.
I can also just say,
Sure.
knowing my dad as I do, he was very, I guess, skeptical of the business. I mean, this whole industry can be very cutthroat, and folks getting over on artists, and they're getting the short end of the deal, the stick, and they're doing most of the work. They're contributing all the material, and so I mean, but it is a business, and Andrew, of course, has mastered it to the degree that he has, and that just shows another layer that. Like Andrew said, it's not uncommon that most other artists don't have that.
Well, Andrew's also done all the work himself.
Exactly.
So he hasn't been exploited because of that, I assume.
This is true. But I don't know about Lawrence, but there's several artists like that who have a cutoff valve that protects them from getting involved on certain levels of business or in business, which can destroy them from a morality perspective. They just won't do it because they have a sixth sense that lets them know that they do not have what it takes to get involved with that kind of thing. So I don't know. Lawrence might have had that, but I know several other artists who've actually told me that. And even the tenor player Joe Henderson, he's told me back in November 1970, he says, for whatever reason, I cannot see the distance between the bandstand and the business desk. He said, for whatever reason, he prefaced it with that, for whatever reason. So that sort of qualifies it right there, whether it's an intuitive thing, but you know what you cannot do to the extent of where you just don't get involved with it.
So what now? I know that Lincoln brought up some rare recordings, and Lorenz has some things, and I'm sure there are some unpublished materials at the house still. Is there any chance that any of this will find its way into the marketplace?
Well, for sure, I think I'm going to make an effort to see about getting it, collected and cataloged, and then I'm sure there are people who are interested in it. So, there's a good possibility that they'll take place. I just want to make sure that all the rights are protected and whatnot. So
I thought it'd be appropriate to take a few minutes and listen to some more of his music. And this is something recorded at the One Step Down. I don't really have a date on this. I'm assuming it's also mid-'80s. Maybe if I tell you the lineup, you'll have a better idea of what period this was. It was Vic Stein playing trumpet, Paul Carr is the alto saxophonist, Chaney Thomas is playing bass, and Mickey Newman is the drummer. And this is a piece of Lawrence's titled Toccata for Tomorrow. actually, the sound quality on this is probably not what it should be. So what I think we're going to do is listen to something else from this unpublished disc. And this is a duet recording that Lawrence made at Kramer Books. You know that place on Connecticut Avenue at DuPont Circle? He did a, if it will cue up, he did a little duet with a tenor saxophonist. It is not queuing up. This is a problem with CDRs, right? With unpressed, non-commercial CDs, is that there are problems like that. So why don't we go back and listen to something else from Homemade Jam, that concert we heard earlier. And this is a piece that includes Buck Hill playing tenor saxophone. And I think this is When You Say, what's the title of that? When You Say You, right? And this is track number 4 from Homemade Jam. Actually, here we go.